Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very happy to share my conversation I had with Stuart Ritchie. He is a Scottish psychologist and science communicator. He is a lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience at King's College London. And he is the author of the book, Science Fictions, How Fraud, Bias, Negligence, and Hype Undermine the Search for Truth, which is essentially a must-have or required read for anybody that is in a psychology program at a graduate level or not. It's very readable for people that are not in any kind of program, but super, super important book. And that's what we spend most of our conversation talking about in the book and some other pieces that he's written for his newsletter. So we start out by starting the conversation by just talking about this theme of trust the science. And we talk a little bit actually about COVID-19 and some of the challenges with trusting the science. Just kind of as a blanket rule, we talk about what that means and what it should mean and maybe how people use it or shouldn't use it. We talk about the scientific method. We just talk about how that works, the process. We talk about the publishing world. It's very difficult in many ways to get published, to get scientific papers published. We talk about how certain campaigns can promote what does and does not get accepted into scholarly journals. We talk about the replication crisis. We talk about various fads within psychology, such as DBT and grit and many other things. We talk about priming studies and why they are not as good as people thought they were. We talk about censorship in journals. We spend some time on the Wakefield MMR vaccine study. We talk about p-hacking, growth mindset, and practical solutions, which is pre-registration, things of that nature for how we can try to improve, social science research. Stuart is a wonderful voice, very clear, good science communicator, brilliant, very sharp. His book is fantastic, and his Substack, his newsletter is also very fantastic. And so he's very good at trying to sift through these things, try to see what is, appropriate to really kind of focus on, other things that might be, kind of wasteful. He's just a great voice all around on trying to look at good social science. And so now I bring you Stuart Ritchie. I'm here with Stuart Ritchie. Stuart, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I've been looking forward to this.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course. So you're quite the writer. I know you have is it a Substack, blog, newsletter? What is it?
Yeah, I used to, over the pandemic, I used to write for a whole bunch of different places, and I still do write for a whole bunch of places, but generally now I'm kind of condensing everything into one place, so it's the Substack. So I've definitely read the Substack. It's great. Everyone should subscribe. You're also the author of the book Science Fictions. It's a great title. How Fraud, Bias, Negligence, and Hype Undermine the Search for Truth. Is this your first book, like popular science book? It's my first proper standalone book. I wrote a book about intelligence in 2015. It was part of a paperback series, though, so it's kind of a different world from the kind of standalone books. It was like the publishers approached me and said, "Do you want to contribute a book to our series on intelligence?" Whereas in this one, it was the whole thing about pitch an idea to publishers and all that sort of thing. So it's been quite interesting, actually, the contrast between the two different ways of publishing the books.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, it's very good. And so we'll talk all about it and some of the stuff, more recent stuff that you've written about. So we have many things to get into. So before we do, just tell listeners who you are, what's your background, and what you currently write on and what you're interested in.
Yeah, so I'm a psychologist by training. I did my PhD in psychology at the University of Edinburgh about 10 years ago. And I'm currently a senior lecturer, which in the US is associate professor, I guess, in the Social Genetic and Developmental Psychiatry Centre at King's College London. So I'm interested in research on cognitive development, cognitive aging, things that influence people's abilities, cognitive abilities, intelligence as they go through life. And my side interest, that's my kind of day job interest, my side interest is in reforming science, scientific integrity. So all the stuff that you just mentioned there in the subtitle of the book, fraud, bias, negligence, hype. And I've kind of been interested in that right since my PhD, and having some kind of weird experiences during my PhD that made me kind of question the way we do science. I'm sure we'll talk about that in much more detail.
Yeah. So that's all wonderful stuff. And your kind of day job and side job, both are super important and much needed. I've definitely talked to a handful of folks here, and anytime I talk to anybody in psychology, so in my world as well, I also have a doctorate in psychology. It's always, what the fuck did we do? Oh my God, why did we go and get this degree? Oh my gosh, is psychology a really, like a good science? Like that nothing replicates. Oh my gosh, there's too many there's so many things that you find after the fact where you're like, yikes. And so people like to beat up psychology as a science, well, forever, since it started, throughout, currently. There are many wonderful things about psychology, many wonderful scientific studies that have been found. So it would be nice to highlight some of those too. However, there are some pretty substantial problems, and that's important because there's a lot of things riding on that. So if our science isn't good, it's hard to hang your hat on something or lean on something if the science is questionable at best, I guess.
And I would actually add to that a lot of people beat up on psychology, as you say, and that's often justified. But it's also the case that lots of other sciences have exactly the same problems. And I can give you examples as we chat. But I think a lot of areas that kind of look down on psychology or maybe social science in general, once you take a closer look into exactly what's going on in those fields, you start to find that there's many of the same kinds of issues, even if not exactly the same problems, the same kinds of issues, fraud, bias, negligence, hype, all that sort of stuff, comes into them too.
I saw that in the book when I was reading. I forget which chapter it was, and I came across that. And I said, "Oh, really? Now, okay. Well, maybe what is it? Misery Loves Miserable Company. It was the social psych researcher that studied that. Yeah, okay. Well, maybe that's not so bad then. If we're all terrible, then that's fine.
It's still quite depressing.
It's still quite depressing, though. Yes, because we're trying to figure things out, and so. So we can go as detailed as you'd like. So let's so we can kind of jump in here. So the first thing right out the gate is you say that science is a social construct. What was the way of kind of starting and framing how we see science in general? I'm assuming you're including physical sciences too, or just social sciences, but science is a social construct.
Yeah, I mainly put that in to sort of troll people because I thought it would be quite funny because they would see it and go, "Oh, wow, what are you saying? Science is a social construct? Are you a postmodernist? Are you saying that science is all just made up, or it doesn't relate to reality, or maybe you're saying there's no such thing as reality or no such thing as truth?" No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that at a very important level, science is a social construct in that it's done by people and it's mediated through a social process, i.e. you have to submit your scientific article to a journal, and other people will look at that and they will judge it not just on its scientific merits, but also on its merits as a finding, how exciting it is, how groundbreaking it is, how important they think it is. And obviously that means a huge number of different things to different people in different contexts, different social contexts. Then the editor will have to make a decision on that. Then people will read your paper and interpret it according to the kind of social stuff that's going on at the time. So basically everything we do, we think, science is this, and we want it to be, and we should try our best to make it this objective thing that's as close to reality as possible. But it's impossible to get it to be, or it's impossible to avoid the social aspects of it. And the argument I make in the book is that the social aspects are where a lot of the problems come in, because we're all human and we all have biases and we all like to cut corners sometimes. And there are people who don't just cut corners, but actively deceive and make stuff up and so on. And that's all part of science being a human thing. I think there's ways we can guard it against that being, those human frailties. but I think we can never get it fully away from the fact that it's a social construct. Yeah.
Yeah, there's something that happened more recently over the past couple of years where people were throwing around this phrase, trust the science. Now, I can take a charitable view of what people that say that mean. You know, it's look, you know, we have scientists out there. I think most of this was concerning a lot of the stuff with, you know, various restrictions or guidelines and or vaccines for the pandemic or for COVID. But you know, this, and sometimes people, I think, were saying this a little bit previously as well for climate science and climate change and how we understand that. So people would just throw this word around. And as someone that really, you know, has done science, I enjoy science and the scientific method and the process. I don't trust science. That's a strange thing to say to me. I mean, I can get what people say, like, don't believe conspiracies or don't believe misinformation. Like, I can kind of see where it comes from, but I don't think anybody is saying that. Most people are saying you should question science. You should try and say, look, this hypothesis, you know, is or isn't confirmed. We have these studies that, you know, can replicate. Okay. But, you know, this isn't a 100%, you know, absolutely confidence of we can know this for sure. There's always things that are, you know, in play, and there's always things that are going to be in flux and could change, especially when you have something like a novel virus. There's it's a moving target. So something that's true today is not going to be true 6 months from now because we're still learning about many things. So what do you think about just in general? So this kind of leading off of this kind of this thread here about people that will say, you know, just trust the science, you know?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting contradiction there, isn't there? Because, you know, if the UK has the Royal Society, right, which is the oldest scientific body in the world. It's a kind of promotes science, publishes journals, has conferences, generally supports science in the UK. And famously, its motto is Latin is nullius in verba, which means take nobody's word for it, right? So it's got that like there's literally inside the Royal Society building, there's a stained glass window and it says nullius in verba on it. Like, the biggest virtue of science, according to that motto, is don't take anyone's word for it. Always question stuff all the time. And yet, you're absolutely right. During the pandemic, we were telling people, well, just take our word for it, which is kind of the exact opposite. So you had this bizarre contradiction. And I can see why people said that, because it was kind of from this sort of paternalistic thing where it's like, well, we know what the science says. You are too busy to understand, you know, to dig into the studies and understand it at that, you know, at that more complex level. So just take our word for it, because we need everyone to be on board with this advice. And we need to, you know, at the start of the pandemic, we need you not to wear masks. Masks are bad. You mustn't wear masks. It's always the example I give because there's this amazing, you know, U-turn that happened in like June, July 2020, where, you know, before that, not only had you had people saying that masks are bad, you'd had them saying that, you know, it's not just that they don't work, it's that actually, you know, you're more likely to get COVID if you wear a mask. And in fact, there were all these kind of psychologists talking to the news, and they were like, well, if people wear masks, there must be something a little bit wrong with them. You know, they're being a bit antisocial and all that sort of stuff. And then you had this remarkable turnaround. And it's not that it's wrong to have a turnaround. Like turnaround, you know, changing your view according to the evidence, or maybe you made a mistake. That's great. Right. But it was the vehemence and the certainty that it was promoted with. It was very much like, you must trust us. My favorite example is this epidemiologist who tweeted, and this is in like, I don't know, February or March 2020. I'm at an epidemiology conference right now. There's 100 epidemiologists in the room. None of them are wearing a mask. So if epidemiologists aren't wearing a mask, you shouldn't either. It's like, there couldn't be a better example of, you know, argument for authority. Do what you're told. And actually, by the time I looked up that tweet again later in 2020, that person actually had like a mask in their display name on Twitter. They completely switched around, you know, and you know, so I wonder if being a little bit less certain about that and saying, well, it's not a matter of trust, you know, you know, we can give you the reasons behind our view that we think masks don't work, but we're not sure. I wonder if that would have made it easier for them to turn around and keep people on side, rather than this weird thing you got where people were completely confused for a while, and then eventually the narrative shifted. But yeah, I do think there's a contradiction there, and I think, but I think a lot of it is this kind of slightly patronizing thing of like, we just need simple messages for the public, and so we just need to just hammer these simple messages over and over again. Part of that was big in the pandemic, but I also think people apply that to other things, like, as you say, climate change as well.
Yeah, I'm going to contradict myself later and talk about, experts in academia. So I can, which in context it will make sense. But I guess the thing that we're probably both saying but not saying is, and I think what most people were saying was like, look, just tell it to us straight. You don't have to, dress it up or sorts. If you say, look, we don't know, we're figuring this out. I mean, I don't think that's overwhelmingly going to cause panic, because I think most people intuitively are like, yeah, what do they know? What do I know? We're trying to figure this out. And I think that there was I think if they came, at certain points, this is just a recent example, but you could see this in other ways. There's something worse about this. So if you say, look, this is a moving target, look, this stuff is always changing. We're going to learn more things about this in 6 months, in a year, in 2 years. And we're going to have to make some amendments to this, or we might completely reverse because we've done more research. That's how it works. I think if some version of that was kind of communicated, I think people would have been you still would have had the same kinds of things, but it would have been a little bit more like, okay, let's see how this goes. But I think it was no, you don't wear a mask. Then it was absolutely wear a mask. And then it was, if you don't wear a mask that says virtue on it, then you're a horrible human being. Like, you know what I mean? It was one of those things where, and people would do the opposite. Like, I'm not going to wear a mask just because. And then you had the same kind of thing with vaccines and all that stuff. But it was one of those things where it became, and people have pointed this out. And I don't think it's a gotcha kind of thing. People see it that way, but it was the same people that were saying that, don't wear or do wear a mask, and then they reverse course. At the time, they were taking people off of various platforms for saying the contrary opinion. And a lot of the times, I think a lot of those folks were in bad faith, to my view. But I think there were a few people that were like, well, wait a minute, let's just think through this a little bit. And that alone, you couldn't do that. Now, is there something to be said about a kind of ethic of, should you be thinking out loud about contrary opinions during the midst of a global pandemic? I don't know. I lean towards no, but everyone's going to have a different ethic there. So I think it's just how far it went of, yes, you cannot have the opposing opinion, and if you do, you will not be able to do certain things or say certain things. At least that's how it felt for a lot of people. And when I talk to people that will be on certain sides of this, they'll say, "Well, see, look, they lied to us here." They're like, "No, I don't think anybody lied. I just think they just got new information and figured it out. Like, that's a thing that happens. Like, you have to understand that." And then the rebuttal is, well, they said this, this, and this. And I think it goes to that problem. You have to be a little tentative on some of this stuff as it's happening in the beginning. And certainly some people did that. But I think the people that did not get a lot of airplay on, media around the world and major outlets. And that was what I think was really problematic.
Yeah, the censorship freaks me out, absolutely. Like, stopping people from saying stuff. If we accept it, it's the classic argument, the classic free speech argument. Like, if we accept it now for our enemies, maybe at some point it's going to happen to us. Right. So I totally am against that and shutting people down and so on. I get that there's an exceptional circumstance in a pandemic, but I would always lean towards letting people say stuff unless it's like really directly.
Yeah.
Unless it's like direct, as has been said, like a Radio Rwanda situation where people are like literally saying, go out and kill someone right now, that kind of thing. I tend to be pro letting people say stuff, but I also think they should be robustly criticized, right? So yes, this is in early 2020. I set up a site with some friends to kind of answer some of the classic COVID COVID skeptics, we called them, or whatever you want to call them, COVID deniers, whatever, the sorts of things that they came up with. Stuff about, all the tests are false positives, the vaccines are dangerous, the vaccines don't work. There was all the stuff about the case-demic, like you have all these cases, but none of them are actual diseases. There's a whole bunch of things. I was inspired by the classic anti-creationist handbook, or counter-creationist handbook, I think it was called, where it had all the claims like there are no transitional fossils, and then there was like evidence that actually there is, which I used to love when I was an undergrad. I used to read that like cover to cover. I'd read the counter-creationist handbook. So we did that for the COVID stuff. But at no point ever would I ever have thought of censoring these people or shutting them down. That's just an extremely unwise course of action. So I think more debate and more uncertainty and more discussion would have been better, rather than the kind of those tweets where people repeat the same thing like 7 times. That's the absolute worst to me.
Right. The only exception, I'll say this, so I'm going to be a box of contradictions today, is that I do think there are some people that, like, people on Twitter or online or whatever. I mean, it's kind of one thing, but I think it's different when it's somebody that has a very large podcast where millions of people listen to it all the time. I won't name names here.
I know you mean.
Everyone knows who I'm talking about. And it's like, I think there has to be a little bit more responsibility if your audience and your reach is literally millions of people. Not millions over a lifetime of an episode, like millions within like hours. I think you have to be way more humble to say, look, I don't know, like there's a lot of stuff going on, like, and I think there wasn't a lot of that, unfortunately. So, all right, let's talk about just kind of I guess kind of the meat and potatoes of scientific research. So just kind of walk us through the scientific process, how it usually works, and then how we haven't taken care of that and how we got there. So just kind of about question, hypotheses, data, methods, the whole thing.
Yeah, well, I think once you understand the process of how it works, you see where the weaknesses are, where the fault lines are, and where the problems can occur. And I think even people who are quite, far through their kind of education, maybe like, postgraduate students or whatever, if you haven't submitted an article to a journal and you don't kind of know how all this works, I think even they can be quite naive about where all these scientific papers come from.
Yeah.
And so I always try and like tell people very early from the start of their career, like
absolutely,
here's where this paper came from. And that's why I started the book with talking about that kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, depends on where you want to kind of consider the start of the process. But of course, in order to do any scientific research, you have to be funded normally.
Well, sure, of course.
So you've got to apply for funding. So the competition starts very early. The competition starts by, you got to apply in this very, very competitive atmosphere for funding from maybe the government or maybe a charity or some other, maybe a private individual sometimes. Like there's all sorts of different.
And there's usually a pot of money that is designed for this. Right.
Yeah.
And then you get all these applications. So when there's no more money, well, sucks to be you. Right.
Indeed.
So that's the whole thing. Everyone is kind of vying for this pot of money for whatever research. Now you're talking about like, it can be large sums of money or it can be smaller amounts, but same concept though applies though. Yeah.
You can already see how hype might come in. You might say, you might feel the incentive to say that you're going to cure cancer, or that you're going to cure depression, or that you're going to fix global warming with new bacteria that'll eat all the CO2 out the sea, or all these, like you can see why people like ramp up these claims. So that's the first part, is getting the money, and you can see where the hype comes in. But then the actual carrying out of the study happens, and that's where various other kinds of problems can creep in, and we can talk about, maybe that's for a separate discussion. But let's imagine that you've done your study, collected your data, and you're doing your statistical analysis. when you finish the paper, you want to send it to a journal, right? So you want to send it to a journal, and journals are rated on, of course, their impact factor, which is calculated on the number of citations that they get, the average paper gets in that journal. And so there's already this kind of ranking of journals with things like Nature and Science at the top, New England Journal of Medicine, and then journals that basically no one's ever heard of at the bottom, Australasian Journal of Insect Research, whatever. I don't know. I'm just making that up. But like, there are all these journals which you probably wouldn't want to publish in compared to publishing in somewhere like Nature or Science. And again, that hierarchy adds loads of competitiveness. The scientists are competing for a small amount of space in these journals. So again, when you're writing your paper, you're thinking about hyping it up. You're thinking about, there's an incentive, a pressure there to say stuff that maybe isn't based on the data in your paper, but maybe makes it sound like you've made a massive discovery. And of course, then there's the peer review process. And of course, we hear all the time about peer reviewed papers. Everyone talks about peer reviewed papers. Well, there's a peer reviewed paper that says this. But if you know what the process of peer review is, that becomes a much less powerful thing to say, because
correct,
the peer review process is sometimes often two, maybe three people will look at your paper. They are themselves very busy scientists who are doing other stuff, teaching students, doing their own research, getting grants, all the other stuff that scientists do, and might not have enough time really to look at your paper in detail. Right. And so there's another issue, which is the quality control process is very, very variable, and it's definitely not at a similar level, even within a single journal, let alone across all different types of journals. The editor then makes the decision to publish your paper or to reject it based on what the reviewers say. The reviewers themselves can be extremely biased, of course, in one direction or another. They can miss stuff. They're very rarely given the raw data from the paper to look through. And even if they're given it, it's very rare for them to actually dig through it and check the sums, basically. Because again, they're very busy. So loads of things can get missed, problems can get missed. This is where scientific fraud sometimes slips through the net. But also more basic stuff, errors, typos in the numbers that mean that numbers don't make sense, and various other sort of mistakes and errors that can come in. Then, if your paper gets rejected from the journal, maybe the peer reviewers are given a negative review. It's not like that's the end of the story, because you simply can submit it to another journal, and if that one rejects you, then another one, and another one, and another one, and eventually you get it published somewhere. So, yes, it's a nice thing to get your paper published in a high impact journal, but you can often get it published somewhere, and you can get your peer review publication somewhere. And I think that's another thing people don't realize is that papers have often, maybe this is the 5th journal they've been submitted to. And
sometimes it can be the 17th journal that they've submitted to.
Exactly. And if you knew that, again, I think that takes away some of the luster of the article. And we haven't even talked about how the analysis itself is often slanted towards finding positive results, for instance, because the papers that are more likely to get accepted in the journals are the ones that say that things work, that there's progress being made, that something's exciting. Null results are often not particularly interesting. This drug does not work, this vaccine does not work, whatever. And that can happen at the level of the paper just being rejected from journals, or more likely to be rejected from lots of journals. Although, as I say, you can often find somewhere else. But it can also happen, the problems can also creep in where you kind of push your results in the direction of being more positive. And there's lots of different ways one can do that. So the whole process from funding to conception of the study to running the analysis to publishing it has all these weak points where bias can come in. And I think there's solutions at every stage, but I don't think the current journal system has taken on board, any really. Well, there's some progress being made over the last 10 years. I think there's some progress being made, but I think there's still these huge problems with the way that we do stuff. But I think there are some solutions, and we can talk about those as well.
Yeah, no, I think there's kind of like a macro and micro kind of way of how this all can break down, and you've alluded to some of them. So yeah, in the beginning, there's obviously the funding piece of it, but typically what happens is but maybe we can give an example. I don't know if you have one or we can make up one, but let's say you and I are two researchers, right? And we want to study something. We have an idea, we have something we've observed or whatever. So we have a question. So we say, I want to look at the relationship between this and this. And I would think that this would be the case, this would be the case, and this would be the case. So you kind of start out with a question or series of questions, and then you develop some hypotheses about those questions. I would expect to find that there is a relationship between this and this. There would be a stronger correlation or not, or whatever you want to say. And then you go and you run it. And so you decide how you want to do that, right? You could do that using quantitative way. So you could use, real, folks, and you could use, give certain measures and instruments and self-reports, maybe a little bit of qualitative, some quantitative aspects, etc. You ask your questions, they fill out, things, you do some kind of interview or, whatever, and you collect all the data, and then you gotta run it through some stats programs. Now, there's breakdowns here on all of these parts, right? The first thing would be, are these good questions, right? Are your hypotheses good? Why would you think this and this is connected, right? So that's kind of, I guess, more philosophical of sorts. But then it's on when you're trying to do the data. So if it's an empirical study, let's just say, because that's easier. I don't feel like doing qualitative stuff because that's a pain in the ass. But if you have participants, how do you collect the participants? Do you have, has it gone through IRB, an institutional review board? Okay, let's say it has. You get these participants. Do you have a large enough sample? What are the things in terms of external validity, right, for certain things that are going to contribute into the participants there? So there's a participant piece of it. There's all these threats to internal and external validity, which we don't have to go over. But and then you have to figure out, well, okay, the measure you're using. So people love in psychology self-report measures, but they're terribly problematic, right? Because they're relying on somebody's self-reports. So if someone thinks of themselves in a particular way, like, no, I'm not depressed, and they objectively are by various, it does depend on like their insight level and their awareness and many other things. So there are problems with self-report measures. Even if you're doing a semi-structured or a structured interview, there's problems there. So they're not wrong to use, but you do have to kind of keep that in mind. Then the problem becomes, okay, well, what stats am I going to use to understand this? Now, if it's a pretty straightforward, I want to see if this is connected with this. What's the relationship between this and this, the dependent and independent variable? You could do multiple regression or, logistic regression, or, it's just not terribly complicated, but it does get more complicated when you start doing ANCOVAs and MANOVAs and, chi-square, and, you're there's a lot more places where things can go wrong. Now, if you're just, really, really good at stats, then maybe not, but you're just trying to see comparing means, you're trying to see what's the correlation aspects, what you're trying to look at for meta-analyses, what's the effect size, etc. So each method has its issues. And then you have to find out what the results say. Okay, there's problems that happen there, right? Because then you want to make sure that all those threats to internal and external validity, are they being implicated here? How do you factor for that with various corrections, things like that? Let's say all that's good. You have a discussion section, future directions. Obviously, you have the abstract, etc. So this is kind of the process, and there's ways at each point. I mean, this is just for the study, and then you have afterwards, right? Then you submit the paper, and then we can talk about preprints and pre-registration, all that stuff later. But you submit the papers, you submit it to the journals. Is it peer reviewed? Is it 2 reviewers? Is it 10 reviewers? Which journal is it? What all these things. There's that whole, and then, right, you get a rejection and you submit it 18 more times. Finally, somebody, publishes it, and you can say it was peer reviewed and it was in a published journal, et cetera, ta-da. And so I guess in terms of this, I've very briefly and probably fumbled over half of it, but this is pretty much the scientific process of how we do things. So where, I guess, anything you want to add to that, but where do things, I guess, start to break down at any one of those points?
Well, I think a major way in which that process breaks down is that people don't often have a plan. You mentioned pre-registration there, and I think this is a really important thing to point out, that I think a lot of people, if you just ask the average person on the street, like, what do you think scientists do? Do you think they, A or B? Do you think A, they have a very set plan of analyses that they're going to run on their data, and they run those analyses and then they publish them? Or B, they kind of have a vague idea of what their hypotheses are, often just a variable hypothesis rather than anything set in stone number-wise. And then they kind of try a few different ways of analyzing it, and they kind of generate a few different types of results, and then they kind of pick the ones that they think are the most relevant, and they kind of make excuses for dropping ones that they don't like, and they kind of and you can instantly see how, in that case, you'd be very biased towards finding the results that you had predicted. And indeed, if you look at the scientific literature, in psychology at least, like well over 90% of results published are positive, right? They support the hypothesis that the authors originally had, and so you can see how that comes in. I think the average person, if you ask them that question, would be shocked to hear that it's B rather than A. Right. I think they would be absolutely shocked. And but that is not how we do things. We don't tend to plan things out. But here's the problem. It's not like we then write in our papers, oh, we kind of tried this and we didn't really know, and then we went on and we kind of did this and we got these results and we didn't really think they were that important, so we moved on to the next ones. No, when you read the paper, what you see is this beautiful, pristine series of discoveries that make it look like everything's been planned right from the very start. So there's this really big incentive to make your discoveries look really unambiguous and really, really clear and resounding and pretty. Like Roger Gino-Sorolla, the social psychologist, talks about the aesthetic standards of psychology. And you wouldn't normally think about aesthetic standards of psychology papers, but there are. Like we want our papers to look good, and often that means sanding down the edges. It means pushing stuff under the rug. Whatever other metaphors you want to use for covering up imperfections. But science is an imperfect process. It's a messy process from start to finish, and so one of the kind of movements that people have had recently, or over the last decade or so, is trying to get people to plan their analyses out and then make it clear when they write their paper, these are the analyses we planned. And by the way, here's some other stuff that we came up with, and it's fine. We're going to report all that because it's good to be transparent. But the ones that we planned are maybe the ones that you should pay more attention to, because they're the ones that we had them planned before we saw the data, and we weren't just like saying, oh, well, that kind of looks like it relates to that, so let's kind of go down in that direction, which a lot of scientists do. So it's this, people have talked about this distinction between exploratory research on the one hand, which is great, like coming up with hypotheses just on the fly, just checking random things in your data set, having a look at what's there. That's great. And then confirmatory research, which is like, I have a hypothesis, I am going to test this. The problem is not that either of those forms of research are bad. They're both extremely good in their own way. But the problem is that when you dress up exploratory research as confirmatory research, which is what we're mainly doing in these journal articles, because that's the incentive in order to get them published in the journal. So that I think is really the fundamental problem. And that can be solved to some extent by publicly pre-registering your analysis plans.
Yeah, so maybe at this point, listeners are realizing here that this is something that I worry about very much, and so maybe listeners might be picking up on it at this point. It does become very instructive what journals are pushing or promoting or accepting. So there's a problem if in either direction of anything, and I can give an example in a minute, something that's less inflammatory, of if there's not a mission, if there's a campaign for something, we're going to publish about this, or we're only accepting papers around this kind of topic, and again, this isn't something that's like, a particular edition or a particular, whatever, commemorative, we want to talk about the history of intelligence studies, and we're going to have these next 3 issues about this. That's fine. But I'm saying as a kind of general approach, that becomes difficult because people that are doing research are not going to get selected for many of these places, and that's not good because then you're not reporting it. And or another big problem is if you do good research and you can peer review it, you could be randomized, controlled, double blind, the works, right? The top-notch gold standard of whatever people want to say. And it's great, but it just gives results that are not in line or in step with whatever the journal is trying to promote. That, and then they say, no, we're not. And, they give you the runaround, but, there's no way that that's getting reported. That's also not good, right? So I'll give an example of this. In the early 2000s, I've talked about this before, in the early 2000s, shortly after the Iraq War and things like that. I mean, some of this was beforehand, but definitely got loaded up on steroids. APA had various flagship journals really pushing positive psychology. And part of this was a campaign to say, look, there's a lot of stuff going on in the world. There's torture, there's waterboarding, there's war, there's all of these things. We have disorders, we have pathology. We need to make people feel good. People are looking at psychology as this doom and gloom, everything's wrong with people. We got to do something about it. So, Marty Seligman, who's fine, but really, I think he was heading APA at this time, or whatever, and he's part of the whole positive psych movement. And there was just this bombardment of all of this positive psych research at the time. If you go back to journals between the years of 2002 and 2007 or 8, I guess. So, it's just all positive psych bullshit. And the point is that they poured a shit ton of money in. So as you're saying, grant money, all this stuff for people to do. I mean, this is all, it goes all the way up to NIH, all these other places, where they're giving money out to do this research, almost as if, let's find it, let's expedite this. We put it out, we publish it. See, here we go. This is a whole other subgenre, subfield of psychology, and it has science behind it. And we just did all these studies in 3 months, and boom, here we go. And there was a lot of cutting corners and stuff. And so then after the fact, you come out of that, and people move on to other things, and then people start trying to say, well, let's go back and look at those studies, and let's see if they replicate. Let's see if these findings are really there. And overwhelmingly, the answer is no. This is mostly, again, now, I'm not saying, so listeners understand me, I'm not saying positive psychology is bullshit per se. I think there was an agenda, there was a whole, campaign. There is some really good things within the positive psych world. I think there is good studies on that. There was another fad here of, mindfulness. Everything was mindfulness. Just so much stuff and putting all this money into it. Again, there's some things there that are fine. But I think what I'm discussing and what you're discussing is this period of institutions or journals and the APA itself, at least here in the United States, are when they want to push something or they want a certain kind of thing studied and things that confirm what they want, you're going to get green lights all the way down the road. And it's going to be very easy for you, as long as you're doing all of the things, but it's going to be very easy. If you're doing, something else, and definitely if you have results that are kind of contrary to whatever the general narrative is, you're going to have a very tough time. You're going to have an extremely tough time, if I would say any chance at all. And, so I'll give another example here. You can answer this for me if you know. I asked my buddy Patrick Lockwood, who talks about this and thinks about this as well, which is, what are the issues right now in back half of 2022 going into 23? What are the main issues in the kind of flagship journals of psychology that are being examined. So let's get the two out of the way. Not gender, not race. None of that. Okay? None of that. What are the other things within the world of research psychology that are being studied and pushed and promoted and put into journals fairly and neutrally and objectively? I don't have an idea. I can't tell you. I couldn't tell you. Maybe you can tell me. I have no idea.
Do you mean in the sense that like there are these trends or sort of fads? I mean, maybe these things are easier to look at in retrospect. Like you look back and you're like, oh, everyone did get obsessed with positive psychology. By the way, on that, did you see all the stuff about the critical positivity ratio?
No.
Did you see all that stuff? Oh, that's the best example of positive psychology.
Okay,
when I say best, I mean worse.
Yeah. What is it?
A really remarkable like physics envy type thing where they took this kind of model from fluid dynamics and said that it applied to psychology. Okay. And if your ratio of positive to negative emotions was above a certain number, it's like 2.8 or something. I can't remember the exact number of the ratio, but it's a very, very exact number. And it went to several decimal places. Then, you would flourish. And if it was below that ratio, then you would languish, or I can't remember exactly what the phrase was, but there were papers published in like top journals with top researchers that claimed that, this fluid dynamics model applied to human emotions. And it was complete nonsense. Like it's meaningless crap.
Right. I mean, to me, when you tell me that, I have like 70 questions of like, okay, this sounds like garbage, but okay, I'll play along. Okay, what is it? Okay, let's see. But it sounds like absolute horseshit.
Yeah, it is. And my colleague and friend Nick Brown, who has since become like a fraud spotter, but when he was doing his MSc, he's had loads of scalps of fraudsters. He's discovered and plagiarists and all sorts of stuff. But one of his first things that he did was debunk this critical positivity ratio. Just point out, he went and actually spoke to a physicist and was like, does this make any sense to you? That physicist, by the way, was Alan Sokal, the original guy who did the original hoax. A very good kind of skeptic. And it was all just nonsense, but it was tolerated because, as you say, there was this big, positivity fad. And I don't actually know what the fads are right now. I mean, you said let's not talk about race or gender. I mean, I think those are probably the big fads now. It's kind of obvious there's a lot more stuff and special issues appearing that are based on those topics. I think there's interesting kind of issues that are happening right now, like genuine, interesting debates that don't seem fad-like, that seem important, and some of them kind of reanimate older debates. Like there's a debate about that pops up quite a lot in literature about what is depression, for instance. Like, how do we define depression? Oh, yeah. Can we measure it in a questionnaire? Yeah. Is there one thing called depression? Is it better to look at the symptoms rather than say there's this thing called depression that causes all the symptoms? Like, that's an interesting psychology debate. I think there's also like more boring rehearsals of previous debates that we've had, like all the debates about behavior genetics, for instance, just pop up over and over and over again. It's the same debate over and over and over again. Yeah. Those get recycled every couple years. It's But I think it's probably easier to look back and see, okay, everyone was really obsessed with that for a while. To be honest, one of the biggest fads, if you want to call it that, or one of the biggest trends in research over the past 10 years has been people talking about the replication crisis. And I think that's been very positive for everyone just kind of saying, like, to what even the people who say this is all overblown, there's no such thing as a replication crisis, like, that's all important part of the debate, and people should push back against claims and test them to their limits and all that stuff. That's great. I think that's been really positive for science, and that we start to like examine the way we do research and question the sort of previous assumptions that we've kind of got ourselves into about, 20 people is fine for a psychology study. Like, all these kind of like things that are just like, they were just sort of sitting there for years and years and decades. And only recently have we sort of said, well, actually, maybe you need, 2,000 people rather than 20 or something in order to get reliable results. Yeah. So on that, I was also going to ask about that as well at some point. So since we're here, maybe just give the kind of like brief overview. I've talked about it at different points with different people and most people,
that are in the literature will, if they're honest, they'll admit that yes, there is this problem. I've talked to, it's kind of what you're saying. So this happens a lot within social psychology. I like social psychology. I'm not picking on social psychologists. A lot of my friends are social psychologists. They're really wonderful people. I really like them. They're the nerdy research branch of psychology. They're much needed. And I really like social psychology work and a lot of my friends there. So don't flog me. Don't beat me up. But a lot of the replication issues comes from these old social psych experiments and studies. It's not only there; it is in other places as well, for sure. But I think those are some of the maybe those are the ones that kind of get picked on a lot. But yeah. So you kind of just say what it is and how we kind of figured that out, and why it's really important, and maybe just some ways or some lesser known studies or things that we say like, this doesn't replicate.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a term that came into the discussion in like 2011, 12. People started talking about the replication crisis, and it was kind of there were a few different things that all happened, and we could talk for the whole hour about each of these individual things.
Sure.
But the first thing that I was involved in was this parapsychology paper that got published in a normal journal. Now, if you don't know about parapsychology is a study of psychic abilities.
What was the paper?
It was a paper by Darrell Bem, who is a social psychologist actually at Cornell, so like top university.
Yeah.
He published this paper in a very mainstream journal, which I attempted to replicate during my PhD. And we can talk about the specific claims in the paper, but the overall result was that undergraduate students displayed psychic powers in this study, and we found that in fact they did not. Like in our undergraduate students, we couldn't find that same result. We submitted it to the same journal that published the original paper, and it caused a big splash. Like, as you'd imagine, like something that said that psychic abilities are real kind of caused a big splash at the time. We sent it off to the same journal, and they said, no, we don't publish replication studies ever. If they're positive, we don't publish them. If they're negative, we don't publish them. It's just our policy. We don't publish replication studies. And that was my big, like, red pill or whatever moment. And I was like, oh, right. Oh, I see. Science is completely screwed then, because we only are interested in the very exciting, like, counterintuitive, weird results, and not maybe psychic powers aren't real. And hey, don't get me wrong, I love parapsychology. I've always been fascinated by parapsychology. I'm a skeptic of all the claims in it, but I think it's amazing that people do that kind of research. And I love the idea of the research being like the experiments being super simple, and like if this is replicated, the only explanation is that psychic powers exist. I just don't think that has actually happened yet. But there's no other. It's not like the experiment's gone wrong at some point. It can only be. So there were two issues here. The first issue is the actual claims of the study were problematic, bizarre,
and they were bizarre. And then the second, and I would say maybe more important problem, is the fact that this journal was not going to publish anything that was counter to it, which, I mean, kind of, sort of.
Well, even or anything that supported it either. Just not doing the same study again.
Not even like commentary on it. Nothing. It was just not. We're not going to do it.
I don't know about commentaries, but certainly like empirical papers that merely repeat the same experiment again.
The same thing. We're going to do it.
Not interested. We had to do something else. Had to go beyond it. But it's like, wait a minute. We wanted to check whether this one was true or not. Right. We didn't want to go beyond it because we want to check whether it's true. There's no point going beyond it if it's not correct in the first place.
Right.
And that happens in so many cases. It's clearly not just parapsychology that happens to, because if you just look at the literature, certainly before 10 years ago, but even still, it's very rare to see like direct replication studies published. Like we merely are taking this paper from 2017 or whatever and just doing exactly the same thing again to check, because that's boring. Who wants to do that? Everyone wants to do the next 6 things.
It is boring to do. Yes, it is. In terms of doing it and writing it and publishing it, it's like, hey, I found the same thing this guy found. Exciting. Like, it's not sexy work. Okay, but let me just. Yes, it should be. Let me put a fine point on this, right? Just so people understand. If you and I do a study saying, you know what, depression is actually because we know it's not a chemical imbalance. We know that depression really comes from your gut microbiome, and with here's all the certain levels in your gut microbiome, and that's why when you're over this, then you're depressed. When you're not, I'm just totally making this up, right? And look, we had an N of 1,200. It's huge, right? Well, I guess for psych studies, and then all this stuff, right? And we did all this, and like, look, we found this out. These are the results. We did the good stats, all these things. Great, wonderful. Boom. Here's this one big study. Okay. And that's it. See, that's the problem. This is the problem, right? Okay. You found something, right? Now, what you need to do is you need to go and replicate that a bunch of times to make sure it wasn't a mistake, an accident, a false positive, fluke. A fluke. Yeah, right. Like that. Okay, we've done this now a bunch of times, and then you start to say, I mean, that's just basic efficacy, right? Like, okay, does this thing that we say work, right? Does it work at least in a lab setting? And then you can say, okay, well, it works here. Does it work for people in Norway in some, some group there? Does it work for kids between these age groups? Does it work now? And then you just broaden it out, and then you say, and then when you hit a wall, you say, okay, doesn't work for this group or doesn't work here, but it does work for all these other things. There might be some reasons why for that, blah, 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 future directions, etc. Somebody else go and do that. So that's the problem here. This is why this is this problem, is that you'll have these kind of like major studies. Maybe they're funded, maybe they're put in a good journal, maybe they became a kind of hot shot, whatever, psychologist or whatever, but they only did it once. And then it's not replicated even by themselves sometimes, or even by other people. And then if it is, and it shows that it can't replicate, or, maybe parts of it do, but not the whole thing does, or something like that. Imagine if somebody said, here's this medicine that we're going to give you. It's experimental. We don't know. And we did one study. And here you go. Go ahead and take it. And somebody says, oh, wait a minute. Let's do like a couple more studies just to make sure, and totally different group. And they run the thing and they do it the exact same way. And it shows the opposite. It's like, well, yeah, well, we already said this works, so that's it. Go fuck yourself. Like, I mean, it just doesn't make any sense, right? Like, this is kind of the problem, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and any kind of anyone who's familiar with the scientific literature regularly knows that all these. Well, I've talked about all the problems that can come in. That the study that you're seeing right now might not actually be representative of the study that was actually done. The study that you're seeing published in the paper. Maybe the scientists are misleading you in some way because they're desperate to get their paper published. Maybe they're they put their thumb on the scale when it came to the statistical analysis, whatever. Even if it is just that one study, I think there are ways of making one single study super not bulletproof, but like much more reliable. Some of the pre-registration stuff that we talked about before, for instance, but it's you'd still always want to see like a repeat of the study. Right back at the very, very beginning of scientific publication, when people were, when Robert Boyle was talking about this, and the very first scientific journals in the 17th century, it was all about, you write your method section in your scientific paper so that other people can come along and do the same study as you to check that you got your result. Like, that's the implicit point of writing how you did your experiment, so that other people can come along and repeat it. And if you don't do that, and actually it turns out that even scientific papers often don't actually report enough details for someone to come along and replicate, which is actually among the reasons people don't do replication studies, because often when you try, you don't have enough details. They've not left a complete map or a complete recipe, in order to repeat the findings. This is what they found in a big cancer research replication effort recently. they had to get in touch with the original authors and like keep going back and saying, well, exactly which reagent did you use there? What was your cell culture? Which temperature was that? You know, all this kind of stuff. Like, why didn't you say this in the original paper? If you got run over by a bus tomorrow, you know, the record of that would no longer exist. So,
right.
It seems very fundamental to me that you replicate studies. And as you say, in different contexts, the replicability might change, but you can build theories about that. You can work out why that might be. But we should always be interested in repeating the same results again and again and again in as many ways as we possibly can. I think, you know, you can get too into that. Like, if the experiment was bad in the first place, like if the original experiment didn't actually show, like it was a poor design and it didn't actually show, like it had maybe it was a trial of something and the control group wasn't very good. Maybe the control group were doing something quite different from the intervention group, and so it wasn't really that good a control. You know, you can repeat that experiment a million times, it's still going to be biased. So you need to, you know, if you're going to replicate a study, and then, you know, finding the same result, it needs to be that study actually was good quality in the first place. So that's an important thing to bear in mind. But yeah, so what happened, you know, after that, you know, after 2011-12, was people started doing more replication studies because, you know, that story with the psychic paper came out, and also a couple of other, like,
Zimbardo is the big one. I mean, that's the big one.
Yeah, there were a few things around about that time that started to get criticized in the old literature. Newer stuff came out, like fraud cases, you know, kind of occurred around that time. And then people started doing these replication studies, like taking 50 papers from the psychology literature and seeing if they can get the same results. And then, you know, the crisis comes about because across kind of all those attempts, and not all of them are like random samples from literature, so it's, you know, you have to be careful with these numbers, but only about half of the findings replicate in that you find exactly the same result again with the same statistical significance in the same direction. And even when you do find the statistical significance in the same direction, it's often, the effect is much, much smaller when you replicate. So there's this kind of decline from the original big claims to when someone comes along and checks, actually, you know, maybe they don't find the same thing. So that's what caused this big crisis of confidence. And then you see other fields other than psychology having the same thing: economics, even AI and machine learning. I mentioned cancer research, like clinical medical research, as well as preclinical stuff. So you start seeing this crisis of confidence happen across loads of different fields. And that's what we would call the replication crisis. And generally, I think people agree that this is a phenomenon that occurred. People then differ as to how important or how expected it is. And a lot of people would come along and say, well, this is just exactly what we would expect, because we all know that science is flawed in various ways. But I think it's a really important thing to have happened, because it focused attention on the fairly easy ways that we can improve the way that we do science, and these big problems with the kind of default ways that we do science that are needless and that we could fix. Right. And that, you know, science would be much better if we just did them.
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing that this is something that I think is we'll talk about this maybe more specifically in a bit, but something that gets really frustrating for me, I can't imagine what it's like for people not in this space, is so you can take big landmark studies, you know, Ash, Zimbardo, Aronson, you know, all these social psych people. And again, I'm not trying to pick on social psych. I have many social psych colleagues and friends that will say, yep. I mean, so, but there are certain things here where what happens is that it kind of becomes like a caged animal let loose, and then you just can't put it back in the box. You can't put it back in the cage. So what happens is these studies come out, wow, oh my goodness, okay, and then it confirms people's Bayesian priors, right? Of course, that's what oh wow, okay, yes, you know. And then what people will do is, and they say, okay, they might do, you know, now for some of these older studies, we're realizing that they don't replicate. So it's like, so what does that mean then? Does that mean that, you know, some of these heuristics and cognitive biases don't exist? Maybe, or maybe it's they're just not they're not the same, or they're altered a little bit. I don't know. So what about superordinate goals? Does that mean that it's like, well, no, I don't. I don't know about that specifically, but in that case, what happens is something kind of gets out, and then we build on top of that. So kind of as a foundational rule, things get built on it, which means that, oh shit, if the foundational stuff has too many cracks, that means all this other stuff is probably not as valid as we'd like it to be. Now, there's a lot of points there that you can kind of say like, well, not necessarily, but maybe, or whatever. And then I think this is where we see fads in psychology where it's extremely frustrating, where there'll be a new thing and people will just run with it. And so I'll give you a clear example. So when I was in grad school, and it wasn't quite there. It was like becoming, like, it had been around for a while, but it was becoming kind of like a thing. More broadly, was dialectical behavioral therapy, right? Oh man, everybody loves this shit, right? They still fucking love it, right? And everyone was like, oh, DBT, you got to do DBT. It's empirically supported. It's evidence-based. It's manualized. It's this. We're finally found a therapy to help folks that have borderline personality disorder, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so I remember in grad school, I did like a kind of a lit review on this, and I wrote a big paper on it, and I just, absolutely like just destroyed it, because I was just like, look, this I think is fine in the setting that it was designed.
Right.
It was designed to be used inpatient for group work, right? So there's a controlled setting here. There's a controlled environment. I don't remember if it was just for women or if it was combined men and women, or maybe it was. I don't quite remember, but there's a certain population of folks, people that have certain disorders with certain, no comorbidities in a particular environment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so then when you would look at it, some of these studies, the stats on some of these other studies they were trying to do with, as you're supposed to, trying to find, does this work with this population? What about outpatient? What about private practice? What about with people that don't have borderline personality disorder? What about they just have problems with affect regulation or whatever? And as you saw the studies, you would see all of the correlations were bad. The effect sizes were small. None of these things really lined up. And it was like, yeah, I don't know. And then it was like, okay, well, if you're theoretically, I think you need a good theory, that's fine. And if you have the science for it, okay. And you have, where it is, it has some efficacy and even some effectiveness, right? Okay, fine. But then it became, okay, well, now we're going to just try and apply it to everything. And it's like, wait. Let's pump the brakes here. Let's wait for the science to come back before we're starting to make a gazillion fucking manuals and then just passing them out like they're free brochures to all of these, clinicians. And that's essentially what has happened. Right. So now you will have clinicians in private practice all around the country, and maybe out there in Europe as well, where they're just doing techniques. And again, some of these people, they don't know, but people will stridently, bet their next unborn child that DBT is the way, and they're doing it this as a type of therapy. And it's like, I don't know. Again, I don't do this research. I haven't stayed up on it, throughout. But the last time I had kind of taken a peek at it, I was like, yeah, this stuff isn't that strong. Is it going to be harmful? Maybe not. But is it going to work? Probably not either. In settings where it hasn't been rigorously studied. But the problem with that, so here's my point. The problem with that is, if you go and you tell the psychologist, the social worker, or whatever, or the counselor, whatever clinician, look, you're seeing people that don't have borderline personality disorder. They're kind of just, high functioning neurotics in a private practice setting. Yeah, you don't need to be doing DBT with them. And you certainly don't need to be giving them worksheets and all these things from a manualized workbook. It hasn't, it might work, but we don't know that because we haven't done the science for it. Let's wait till we do that, and they'll get very upset.
So I don't know about this particular thing, but it strikes me that, there are all these things where they claim to be evidence-based. And I think it comes from it comes from a sort of fetishization of peer-reviewed papers. Like,
yeah, it's in the same world.
There's a couple of peer-reviewed papers out there, and so we're just going to cite them for everything, even if they don't actually back up specifically what we're claiming here. And as you say, like, it can go way beyond what those original papers. But there are papers, and that's why I think it's important to like let people know what the process of actually, you know, getting a peer-reviewed paper is. And often it's quite easy, and it doesn't actually imply the level of quality control that you think it does.
Yeah. And so I just think you see that with a lot of these fads and everything. So let me just pick on one thing here. And I think this became really sort of the poster child for this. Again, it's just going to seem like I'm terribly cynical, and I'm trying not to be. I do want to reserve time to talk about some of the really good examples. So we'll get there. But priming studies, I mean, were all the rage, especially again in social psych. Please forgive me, all my social psych friends. But priming studies were like all the rage. And I think what made this really interesting was that, you know, you had Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, System 1, System 2 by Danny Kahneman, and like every, you know, and look, I mean, he's still the only psychologist to win a Nobel Prize for economics, not for psychology, but that's beside the point. Like he, you know, like he's a big deal. He's a rock star. I get it. Like, and look, he's done incredible work. I'm not going to take anything away from the guy. He's a legend. Like, he's done great work. You know, he deserves all the accolades. I'm not going to take that from him. However, okay, so here's the good thing. He has admitted to this, which makes me happy, because that says, you know what? There's something there. He has a good ethic. He has a good way of saying that. But there was problems with a lot of things he said. So, I mean, you can explain it better than I can. Just kind of say, like, what were some of the issues here as an example of, like, priming in another way in which we see this happen.
Well, that book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is, you know, a combination of his own research, which I think has held up very well in terms of replications, and also just, you know, fairly fit into a kind of body of knowledge that we have about biases and so on, which I think is really important. Yeah. But he also described other people's research, and the book came out in 2010.
That sounds right. That sounds right.
Then. Yep. And kind of before the big replication crisis stuff had really kicked off, or around about that same time, actually. That was a very interesting, you know, few years for psychology. You know, he talks about studies like, for instance, the flag priming studies, where if you well, actually, I'm not sure you're talking about flag priming. You're talking about money priming studies, which is where you see pictures of money, like literally like banknotes on a screensaver on a screen in the room that you're in. And then it makes you more selfish when you do a group task later that day. So it makes you like put the chairs further apart because you're not interested in being near other people, like things like that. These are studies that were published in literature, which have very much not held up in terms of their you know, replicability. Like, other people have tried to find these same results and have really not.
Isn't the famous one about music in the liquor store? Have you heard this one? Where it's like, oh, if you're in a liquor store and there's classical musical playing, you're more likely to buy a more expensive bottle of wine or whatever. I don't know how true that is, but
I can totally picture it. There's also one which I don't think has ever been like, no one's ever attempted to replicate it. It came out in 2012, I think, where there's participants are doing a creativity test, like how many uses can you come up with for a brick or a tire? Like, you have to come up with like creative things. And in half of the cases, they're sitting in a room next to a cardboard box, and in half the cases, they're sitting in the cardboard box, right? And the result is that the ones who are sitting next to the cardboard box had a better creativity score because they were thinking outside of the box, right? like literally. So they were primed by the idea, and there was a literal like instantiation of the metaphorical idea, which somehow actually changed their creativity. Like, obviously not true, obviously nonsense. Massive effect sizes in that paper as well. So these kind of things that wasn't mentioned in Thinking Fast and Slow, but there were several that were right. And there's this famous passage where he says, and again, this is like fetishization of scientific peer-reviewed papers, right? Because he says, it's not just that these happen to other people. It's that I'm paraphrasing. This isn't a direct quote, but it's not just that these things happen to other people. It's that they will happen to you as well. You have and this is a quote, you have no choice but to believe that these findings are true or correct or whatever exactly he said. But it's that you have no choice thing. It's like, no, actually I do have a choice, because I can look at those studies and see that they're very, very weak. And actually subsequently people have come along and failed to find the same results. So Kahneman has since, as you said, like backed down on those studies and said, like, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have put all my eggs in the basket of that kind of social psychology priming research. And generally that kind of style of research has gone out of fashion. That was a fad for a long time.
That was, and people don't really do them anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of that is because of these.
That's right.
Issues.
Right. And look, again, the point isn't to try and do like gotcha stuff and be like, aha, see, like all your work sucks. Like, that's not the point. The point, I mean, maybe some bad faith actors do that, but
that is,
you're trying to make sure it's good science.
Yeah, exactly. They're often, when people focus on these things, another one is like power posing and stuff like that. They're doing it because they're examples of where research goes wrong. And like, these are really obvious examples of where things have gone wrong, but the same principles apply to other, areas. Cherry picking data points, samples that are far too small, right? Doing loads of analyses and only publishing the ones that support your favored effect. Like all these things apply to like epidemiology research and vaccine, whatever, all sorts of research that we want to rely on, and we need to protect against. So yeah, these are nice examples, and they're kind of fun examples as well, because it's like a lot of like, often it's quite an amusing,
right. It feels very kind of like low stakes kind of thing.
True. Right. No one's getting people are being harmed in the fact that like people are spending money on these things and they could be spending on something else. like we're paying professors to do these things, paying participants and all that sort of stuff. So
sure. Yeah.
Giving grants, but they're not being harmed in the medical sense.
Yeah. Right. So okay, so give me an let's. So we've really just beaten this dead horse now, which is great. But let me just give like an example, like a really good example of studies that do replicate, or some that have, and what we would expect from studies to replicate. So what would we look for? And maybe we can give some examples. I don't know if Big Five, in terms of personality, that's replicated. I'm pretty sure it has. Maybe that's an example, or you can think of a better one.
Yeah, I mean, the personality stuff is a good thing to focus on, because a lot of people say things like, intelligence research and personality, they really replicate, and other studies, other areas don't. So we should favor intelligence research and personality. That's true to a certain point, right? There are lots of things in intelligence research and personality that replicate every single time. For instance, the correlation between intelligence and is like your score on an IQ test and how long you'll stay in school. Yeah. But the reason that replicates every time is because it's quite boring. Like it's quite an obvious effect.
And you have more tangible, I would think, more tangible metrics to look at.
Sure. And don't get me wrong, it's, we've made lots of kind of progress in understanding the psychometrics of these tests and so on. But also, like, these are more boring claims than, if you set outside a box, it will activate the metaphor, thinking outside the box, and it will cause you to become more creative.
Like you have psychic powers or whatever, right?
Right, exactly. Right. One reason that some fields replicate better than others is because they're asking a different kind of question, and they're asking questions that are, in some sense, more boring, but also just more mundane. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I just mean that they're a bit more kind of straightforward, the questions. And that's part of when you are looking at the replicability of a field. You want to. People talk about the prior probability of an effect, like the prior probability of effects in personality research. Like people who score high on extroversion on a personality questionnaire are more likely to go to parties. It's like, okay.
Right. That tracks, right?
Yeah. What's not been so good in those fields is when they try and relate personality, for instance, to the brain or genetics, and those areas, there haven't been many like super reliable results coming out there. Like, where in the brain can we look for conscientiousness or neuroticism and so on? So I feel like that stuff is they're the more daring, the less safe questions to ask, and they have sort of poorer replicability. So, comparing across different fields, you have to be a bit careful. But within personality, I think, there's been attempts to replicate things like, do the big five personality factors: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism.
Right.
Do they predict important life outcomes? And yeah, I think that's pretty clear that they do. And people have looked at sex differences and all these kind of things, and like that stuff holds up fairly well, I think. So those are things that we know.
across the lifespan, I know there's been work done on it, cross culturally. And it seems that anyone can look this stuff up. Who was the main person? Is it McRae or what was it?
Costa and McRae are the two researchers that came up with the big five, or one of the main instantiations of the big five. Yeah.
And you can just kind of literally just hyperlink throughout and just find like where's the next and where's the next and and then you're like, oh, okay, like same thing, like it confirms this, and so like. Yeah, maybe it's not like you have psychic powers, but it's like truly though, when you're talking about human intelligence and you're talking about human personality, and we've done a lot of good studies to show that those things, or those qualia there, do replicate. That's what you would want to replicate, the very fundamentals of human nature. Right? Yeah. Like if people are just saying all of these like spurious things about human intelligence, and then it doesn't replicate, you would be like, well, fuck that guy. Like, and then of course, then people will say, I think what you're right is once you start getting to like neuroscience, and then when you start into genetics, then it starts to get a little bit more out into deep space there. But it's like, it's not completely dismissible, but that's where you get less, on thick ice. But it's like, that's fine. Like you can still say the core elements of it have replicated, and we can definitely be sure of these, whatever claims or these things that have replicated. As you get more outside of that, then you can say, well, we're still trying to figure that out, or there's a lot of things that are in the mix here, etc. Right?
If people want to read a perspective on this, which kind of covers these kind of issues, there's a really good 2016, I think, paper by Robert Plomin, the behavior geneticist, and it's called something like Top 10 Replicated Findings in Behavior Genetics.
Nice.
It focuses very much on the twin research type of behavior genetics, so like twin and family research, rather than the newer, actual measuring DNA stuff, which I think is a bit very replicable in some ways and not in others. And so there's interesting, it's very much that frontier where it becomes a little bit less certain. But yeah, there's an interesting, he points to several findings that have replicated across many, many different like twin studies, for instance, and then talks about why they tend to be more replicable. And so, yeah, if you're interested in this question, then that's a good paper to read.
Yeah. Okay, so one thing I want to ask, there was something more recently. So a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about comes in your book. So for people that are interested, science fictions, how fraud, bias, negligence, and hype undermine the search for truth. Everybody go get it. But there is one thing that you've written about more recently, where there was this Nature article that came out a couple months ago, I guess, about racist research. And in your book, you point out that there has been racist research, right? But then there's a recent article where there is some. And so how do you parse these two out, where it's like, some of this stuff we have to deal with, but then I don't like, or I don't think anybody likes when it happens in research. How do we understand, how much do we... Is it just kind of like a way of like intentions here of like what's driving this kind of thing? Or is it just like the results kind of could have implications, but people weren't trying to do that? How do we deal? Look, and we can, I'll just rip the Band-Aid off here. We can talk about a little bit if you want, intelligence and race, that's the big thing, right? But yeah, what do you kind of make of like kind of the racist aspects in research sometimes, or that it could be used for racist intentions?
Yeah. So the Nature, it was in Nature Human Behavior, which is like one of the Nature stable journals, but they said it applied to all Nature journals, I believe. So the rule, so this was a set of rules for how you should do your research, and it wasn't just about race. It covered, it essentially boiled down, in my view, and people can go and look at this if they want, but it boiled down to, if it might be the case that your research might cause offense to people, and we count offense as harmful, then we reserve the right to reject your paper. And that I think basically, maybe unstated or hinted at, was that we reject the right to reserve the right to reject your paper, even if the paper itself is actually methodologically completely fine. But if the results might cause or the topic or the results might cause offense, and they talked about they would consult with advocacy organizations. I can't remember exactly what the way they phrased it on this topic. Interest groups, I think they may be called it. And and as you say, I talk about in the book, I talk about the old, research on measuring skull sizes and how that was clearly done with racist intentions and so on. So I'm completely on board that there can be racist biases in the way we do our research. Right. But my big problem is that my definition of racist research might be different from what yours is, might be different from the editors of this journal and so on. And I think codifying things like that, saying that we will retract all research considered racist without really defining, without giving any examples, and no examples were given of research in this that might be considered to be racist or offensive or harmful in any way. They did not give any concrete examples. I think that basically is a blank check for people who have an interest in suppressing research for political reasons or for any other reason, to basically lobby journals to retract or correct or change or reject articles that they find offensive. One example that's been given is, you can imagine if someone tried to publish an article that said abortion is actually, doesn't have any mental health effects on the woman who has an abortion, and we think it's, in terms of psychiatric outcomes, it's completely solid and completely, harmless. You can imagine a pro-life organization lobbying the journal to say, well, we find this really offensive. You're talking about murdering a baby, all this kind of stuff. And so we want this paper retracted, even if the paper itself was methodologically completely sound. And that would fit with what they described in that editorial. It would fit perfectly with them saying, we'll consult with outside groups and we'll get research and we'll retract research if we decide those groups have made a case that they find it offensive. So it doesn't necessarily just have to be race stuff. It could be a huge range of different things. I think the intention behind it was to stop people from publishing, sort of troll-like papers that mix up race and intelligence and all this kind of stuff, which there have been examples of that published, bad faith research on these topics. Absolutely.
Right.
But I think the vagueness of the guidelines makes it a real threat, I think, to academic freedom in many respects. I don't like to go down the culture war and make everything out to be it's like the fall of civilization or anything. Not at all. I just think that if this reasoning was applied across all journals. And one thing people say is that, well, journals already do this. If they think that paper is has racist conclusion or might offend someone, they might reject it. First of all, I think that's usually quite bad, because you should be evaluating things on the basis of their methodological scientific quality, not what you think, you think it might be used in future. But also, I think writing it down makes it much easier. Like having it as the code of conduct in your journal makes it much easier for people to come along and like deliberately try and suppress research. And just one more thing, which is that this whole, people push back against when I did a tweet about this. People push back and say, well, are you trying to say that, offensive research like Joseph Mengele, you're trying to say that would be fine for people to do? No. The reason that wasn't allowed was because of that shouldn't have been allowed was because it was unethical, right? The methods that were used in the research were unethical, and that's why we have ethics committees and IRBs, as they call them in the US, who check the methods of research. that's completely, totally fine. Although I actually think there's some, for instance, there's a big debate about challenge trials. Like, should we allow people to deliberately inject people with a virus so they can test whether vaccines work quickly? If, those people are completely consenting. I think ethics committees do often get in the way of that kind of thing, but that's a whole different thing.
One cancelable thing at a time. One thing at a time.
Yeah, I know. This is the difference between criticizing and saying that research is bad based on its methods. And I think that's important. We should always consider that. This Nature editorial or Nature Human Behavior editorial moved it to saying that research is bad based on its results. And that is what the fundamental problem to me is. Because you can imagine two papers with exactly the same methodology that come to different conclusions about some relation between one thing and another, and one being completely fine according to these guidelines, and one being completely offensive and being retracted because of these guidelines. And I think that's not the place where we should be when we want to follow the truth and we want to discover what's actually real.
Okay, so let me be on the other side of this. So, look, this journal, that's their right. If you don't like it, then go get published somewhere else. We have a right to do that. You don't like it? Tough shit. That's how we're doing it.
I agree with that. And I certainly will never submit anything to that journal ever again. Absolutely. Even if it's the most inoffensive research imaginable, there's no way I will ever submit anything. Right. Yeah, of course not. Right. And I'll tell everyone else that they shouldn't either.
Don't submit your shit over there. Don't do it.
But again, that's my prerogative to do that. I'm not saying that the government should step in and force the journal not to do this or something like that. I'm just saying I think it's bad that the journal is doing this. And I also think, given that it's Nature, and Nature has that kind of cultural cachet of being like, the biggest journal in the world, I worry that other journals will follow and it will become a thing, and it will have negative effects on people's ability to study the things that they want to study, which I think is, usually an important, academic freedom is a thing that we generally all sign up to.
Well, I think there's another piece here that you're bringing up, which is important, which is that it's not about the data itself or the results or what's being studied. It's more of, could it be perceived by whichever body in the journal here, the ethics committee or whatever, as being potentially offensive, which, right, is way too broad. In every journal right now, to pick your person or pick your group, they could find it offensive. And I guess the point of that is that my thing is, why? So kind of going back to the first thing we talked about, science isn't supposed to be your dogma. It's not supposed to be your religion. It's not supposed to be your, ceremony. And it's certainly not supposed to make you feel good. I mean, there's plenty of researchers, investigators, and that will do the research themselves and they'll be like, yikes, I was not expecting this result when I did this. Holy shit, now I have this. And wow, that goes against my priors. This happened to me recently. I was talking about it with Hannah Bradshaw. She's a researcher here in the United States, and she looks at discuss sensitivity. And I'm going to totally mess it up, but it was something that, so I'm not going to try, but it was something about how, something about like in some of the research, different studies that have been done, that she had done and others of, if you have higher disgust, I'm going to mess it up, so don't quote me on this, but higher disgust, there's something where there's a gendered component. So I think if you have higher disgust sensitivity, that's usually seen in more women, and if you have lower disgust sensitivity, that's seen more in men or whatever. I'm totally butchered this. And in the conversation I had with her, I had a reaction to it. because it felt like that whole like stereotype of like, oh, women can't handle, icky stuff or whatever. And it didn't make me feel good. Right. And so she was like, well, if that's what it says, that's what it says. Like, why do you have that reaction? I was like, well, it's just, I don't know. It's just, I don't like having like, it didn't make me feel great. Like when you hear the conversation, you'll hear me very like kind of resistant to it. And like, I felt that way with many things when I first look at data or when I first, look at a paper and if it's good science and it has good results and it replicates and all these things, because at first I'm like, okay, well, what about this? Okay, well, maybe not so much. Okay, well, let's see, or let's keep looking at this. And if it all checks out, and then it's like, fuck. I was like, this does not make me feel great. That happens. You could look at any data points or in any journal, and you could find something that could potentially be offensive. So I guess it's like, why would you want to try and sanitize people's view or understanding of science? Because my first thought with that, for again, especially such a very big journal, is everything I'm going to read in that journal from there on out, I'm going to be wondering,
right,
what are the things I'm not reading? Yeah. What am I not seeing? And just because I don't want I mean, again, like. Again, I think if you have ethics committees or IRB, you can most certainly be like, look, we're not going to do an experimental study on waterboarding. Like, yeah, fine. Okay, absolutely. Like, there is limits to this. I'm not going to do this whole culture war thing. Like, I'm censored, all this stuff. Like, I understand those claims, but it's like, okay, it doesn't need to be that. But this is also problematic, though. And I think for what you're saying, the trickle down effect of, well, shit, if nature does it, then Psychological Bulletin's going to do it. And then all these other things. And then we're just not going to have, there's already problems in getting studies there. And then there's going to be problems with, we're going to have two things that happen. One is, well, what fucking science are we not hearing or learning about? That's a problem. And then the second thing is, you're going to have other journals with people that aren't able to do in the premier places, and those are going to be the blacklisted journals, those are going to be the white supremacist racist journals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And then you have this splintering of science, much like in the same way, but worse, I think that we see with climate change. Climate change has become a left-right issue, and that's preposterous. And so now if anybody on the right says anything, affirming of, kind of what we know about climate science, all of a sudden, they're not really conservatives. They're in the United States, they're rhinos, or they're a shill for the whole blah, 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 the lobby, this, that, and the third. And if you're, on the left, right, and you say something like, well, wait a minute, like, maybe we have made some progress here, here, and here. It's like, you don't believe climate science and you're a denier. It's like, I'm just saying, like, maybe like all of this, we have had some good stuff on reforestation and the ozone layer closing. And, there is still many issues, but yeah, we can also know, you know what I mean? Like, and it becomes this thing. I wouldn't want that for like, Journal of Medicine.
Yeah, totally.
You know what I mean? Like there is a big problem there.
Yeah, I think, you see this in fields that are very, very controversial. Like, you mentioned the race IQ question, right? No one wants to touch that question. Everyone who touches that question.
I know people that have, and they don't have jobs.
Right. Right. And the problem is that when, sensible people look at that question and then get hounded by either side, I mean, you get, if you put any argument either side of that question, which is why sensible people just don't ever talk about that question on social media, you will get hounded by one side or the other, including in some cases people get hounded out of their jobs for things that they've published on. As you said. And what does that leave? It leaves, on the one side, people who don't care and who'll just publish anything and they'll make their own journals in some cases and end up publishing all this crap that's completely low quality, doesn't answer the question, biased, dramatically biased. And on the other side, you've got people who, I would say, having had victories of, getting rid of some of these people who are on the opposite side to them in terms of, they believe that there is a link between race and IQ and all the genetic and all that sort of stuff. they then expand the circle of what they consider to be bad and racist to the point that, you know, so any research on this. And so you've got these extreme people on either side, and moderate people just don't want to talk about this stuff at all. Right. And I think it's not even just a question of race. I think just generally intelligence, and not just intelligence, but I mean, think of research on the trans question, like gender stuff. Think of research on some very controversial areas in psychiatry. The moderate people don't want to ruin their lives, and so you just get extremes on either side. So I think anything that allows people more of an in to shut down research that offends them just will ruin what you really want, which is to get serious answers to a scientific question. You want sober, normal people who are scientists, who are not extreme ideologically, to come in and dispassionately look at the data in as clear a way as possible, in transparent a way as possible, non-ideological a way as possible, to try and get to the answer to a question. That's just not going to happen, and you're just going to end up with this spiral of extremism. And so I really think this is pushing things in the absolute wrong direction.
Yeah. And here's my thing. This is the thing that I really worry about. And it really worries me. This is the thing that everyone's got their issues. I know many people that are activists on both sides of things, or they'll take an issue and like that's where they plant their flag, and they've quit their jobs and they're just doing this full time on whatever issues. And not that way. And that's fine. Everyone can do their own thing. But the one thing that keeps me up at night is this fast burn. I don't think it's a slow burn anymore, of institutions being completely corrosive. And this is an example of that. I don't like on one way or the other, even if it agrees with me, even if I agree with it, I don't like it, because that's not right. Like, you have to have it's fine if you have like opinion places, or social media, or alternative sectors. That's fine. But when you have institutions that service everybody, it should not be one way of thinking. I think that's a problem. That's a huge problem. And that's certainly a problem with any type of science, or any type of medicine, or any type of healthcare, or any type of education. We should not have that. Right. This is why. So in the United States, I fought against, people that were saying like, we should ban critical race theory. It's like, no, I mean, maybe we shouldn't teach it to 5-year-olds, but like, no, let people learn about it and make their own decisions. Yeah. Don't not teach the other stuff. And that's what was happening. Or don't teach everything else through that lens. Okay. Just, you can teach that. That's fine. It's like evolution. It's like, okay, unless you're at a Christian school or private or whatever, like, you should teach, hey, these are some theories about it. Evolution is the fact of life, but there are other views on this, creationism and whatever else. That's fine. I have no problem with you teaching that. Let people make up their mind. You can say like, this is the standard and here's why, but here's other ideas about this, right? And I'm vehemently against creationism and all of that fucking garbage. But that's fine. It doesn't mean you shouldn't study or look at it. It doesn't make any sense to me. And so the thing that keeps me up at night is, yikes, institutions that service everybody should not have one bent towards one ideology, or one. You can have an ethics, that's fine. Or you can have, maybe a slight bias, but it should not be kind of like in this case with nature of, well, anything we find offensive, for science. This isn't an op-ed journal. I mean, that's crazy. Anything that we find offensive, or that we think other people might find offensive, which is everything on the planet. I mean, exactly. Go ask flat earthers if they find it offensive that we say the Earth is spherical. Look, then we're not going to publish that. That doesn't make any sense.
Well, I think this is important in the case of institutions that serve everyone. I think you can, in some cases, it's fine for them to have one view. Like, I don't think they should be teaching alternatives to the round earth theory, but I do think, but I do think institutions that claim to be objective should avoid that sort of stuff. So, for instance, a few Substacks ago, one or two, I can't remember how many Substacks ago, I wrote an article about. So it was in Science. So not in the journal Science, but on the website of the journal Science, which is kind of like the American Association for the Advancement of Science, like the general kind of the general sort of journal. They have a whole bunch of journals, and then they have a news thing that's attached to that. So it has the kind of
for the layperson of sorts.
Yeah, and it has the it gets some of the authority from being associated with the journal Science. Right? So they published this really unusual thing, which is they published like a point-by-point rebuttal to a Tucker Carlson monologue at the start of one of his things. And it was about Anthony Fauci, and he was really, ranting and raving and saying all these completely untrue things about Anthony Fauci, which and I was really in two minds about it, because I think it's really important that these things are debunked. But I really don't like it that scientific journals or their associated news websites are getting political like this. And I wouldn't want it to be a regular thing. I wouldn't want it to be a common thing. And I have a similar feeling about scientific journals that publish, for instance, in the last US presidential election, Nature, Science, and the New England Journal of Medicine all published editorials that either endorsed Biden or like strongly criticized Trump.
Oh yeah.
Now, I was desperate for my personal view was I was desperate for Trump to lose that election and to get rid of the complete absurdity of that whole situation. And I was very glad that Biden won. But that's just my view, and I completely agree with what you said. Like, even though that is my view that they were promoting, I don't want scientific journals to have overtly political content in their editorials. I'm not even sure I want them to have an editorial in the first place. Like, do they have to have an opinion section like a newspaper? Does it really have to be that way? My impression is, I don't have data for this, but my impression is that kind of thing is becoming much more common at scientific journals now than it used to be back in the day, 20, 30 years ago. I'd like to see some data on that, actually. I'd love for someone to do a survey of like political content in scientific journals. And I think that's corrosive. Yeah. I think that's corrosive of there are some institutions that everyone needs to be able to look at and say, this is an institution that's doing its best to be objective. And I think when you look at the politicized content that you see on a lot of these journal websites now, you can no longer do that. And then, as you were saying for another topic earlier on, like, can you really trust everything that's in the journal? Like, are they publishing absolutely everything that you would want them to publish?
Well, again, it goes to the whole thing of like, if this is science, isn't just for one side of things. Science is, and it should be for everybody. If you're too politicized, again, I'm not saying if there's a certain kind of bent or some people have certain types of ways they want to say certain things. I mean, I could see some of that, but like, you cannot have this, and where that's the case, and I think that's it's just a big problem. And because what happens is what you have happen now, and really just the aftermath of this is, I think a lot of it was here in the United States with Trump, and a lot of it definitely got doubled over with the vaccines and stuff, and with the pandemic, which is nobody trusts institutions anymore, and so much that people don't trust the idea of an institution. And that's a problem. That's a deep problem, because my case for institutions is, if you have a massive country with many people, you cannot have everybody doing their own thing. Not kind of in isolation. So if in the United States, there's 330 million people. We cannot have 330 million people getting 330 million different types of education. You just can't do that. Or 330 million types of healthcare. Even in the United Kingdom. Now, I follow this not terribly closely, but I know many people aren't favorable of the new prime minister, and there's some serious concerns there.
We've been chatting for a couple of hours now, and I'm fully expecting to go out and find that the prime minister is resigned. It's not today, good. The day we're recording this podcast, it's incredible level of turmoil in UK politics.
It's but again, we have to have institutions that are keeping it's like an adhesive for the culture and for society. It's like, look, it's going to be imperfect. It's not going to be the best. We should reform them. We should always be working on it. But that should not be where we just say, well, we just don't need them at all anymore. That's it can't be this Wild West of sorts. Like, that's not helpful.
I think there's a kind of toxic reaction that people had to the Trump, criticism of the institutions, which was to say, well, you're saying that the institutions are all evil and politicized. We're going to double down and be as politicized as we possibly can in these institutions. And like during the pandemic, that was clearly the case.
Yes.
And for other institutions too. And I think, and actually I wrote one of my very first articles on my Substack was about this. People say something similar in science. They go back to the very first question that you asked me, which was about, like, is science a social construct? And I say, yes, it is. And they say, that's a good thing. Like, science is political. And actually that's good because we all want to change the world. We're activists. We want to change things. And I say, I agree that science is political, but that's bad. Like, it's bad that it's political, and we need to do our very best to get that out of everything we do in science and to really tie our hands so that we can't let our political biases intrude on the science that we do. And, there was lots of interesting discussion about that article and got lots of attention and stuff. But so people can go and have a look at that if they want. But I see this really lamentable tendency of people to say, well, everything's political. Everyone's got a view. There's no view from nowhere. So it's absolutely fine for me to be a liberal scientist or a conservative scientist or a feminist scientist or a socialist scientist or whatever it is. Like, no, that's bad. That's obviously really bad. And it depresses me a little bit that we have to be in this situation where me saying scientists should try and be objective if possible, even if they can't be 100% objective. Like, we're in a situation where that's seen as quite a controversial statement. I find that like that's one of the most fundamental things about science. Like it's very similar to what I view as one of the most fundamental things about free speech and so on. Like I feel like we're in a situation where we're having to defend these very basic ideas against people who are maybe a bit tired of the old basic stuff and want to say something a bit more controversial or more contrarian. But I think these basic principles, free speech is good. Scientific research should try and be objective. Like these are really good ideas, and we should really try and defend them.
Yeah, I fully agree, and I think that's it's how fast that's changed is also worrisome as well. And yeah, I mean, it's like when people would ask me, like, oh, in the United States we had a march for climate or something like that, and people would say, are you going to go to that? Are you going to do that? I was like, look, I care about climate change. I care about the planet very much so. I make my own changes to my own life and how I do things. Yeah. I find that march reprehensible because it's politicizing something that's for everybody. And immediately people on another side of things are going to say, I'm not going to listen to a word of anything on this. And that's a big fucking problem when you're talking about, and I just feel like not everything, and this is now on both sides of things, and it just drives me absolutely fucking bonkers. You don't need to be an activist for everything. And you don't need to go full tilt. Like it's some things, yes, for a moment, but then you scale it back, and like, we don't need to always be on 11 for everything. And you can still be, I mean, there's so many things I'm passionate about. I mean, people listening to this conversation know I'm passionate about this stuff, but I'm not out there, doing wild stuff, as an activist for this. There's a place for it, but there's other ways of handling this. And all you start to do is you just start to talk to an echo chamber you've built. And if the whole point of activism is to raise awareness, well, it's like, I don't know how much you need that. If you want to know about something, you're going to find out about it very quickly online for sure. Okay. And even if you're not online, like, I don't think we need these big campaigns of creating awareness that activists do. I think a lot of it is just bad incentives. You get your own, following and whatever. I want to ask you about, I really want to ask you about this because I've known about this, and then I read it in the book, and it's like, it's so upsetting to me. It's so upsetting to me. Is so you can take as much time as you want on this. The Wakefield MMR, right? And so this was the whole autism thing. Please, can you just lay it out? What? Because I cannot tell you how many of these fucking conversations I've had with people. They're like, vaccines cause autism. I'm like, fucking Christ. This like. The train is gone. Like, we've already realized that this guy's been penalized, like the whole thing. And so yeah, just lay it out for us. What happens?
It's a nice example of what we have mentioned a couple of times in the conversation, which is the kind of people fetishizing peer-reviewed scientific studies. So the Lancet, which is widely considered, I think, the like second top medical journal in the world, like
yep.
You know, it's seen as a very authoritative source.
Mm-hmm.
Published this paper in 1998 by Andrew Wakefield and several other doctors in the UK who had a series of, I'm not going to get the numbers right, but I think 12 kids who had gut issues and autism, and claimed that there was a link between the vaccine, the gut issues, which he called autistic enterocolitis, and the autism. So the vaccine caused some sort of weird issues in the gut, which then also caused developmental delays and autism spectrum disorder. This is based on, let's say, 12 people. So even if the results had been completely solid, you would want to do those replication studies and you would want to look into it in more detail. However, the Lancet saw fit to accept this article and publish it.
Why? I mean, that's such a small N.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it was 1998, so it was a while ago. There wasn't the awareness that we have now, maybe, although it's still fairly obvious that was a bad study.
Even as a baseline, most people want, if you can get over 30, but like over 50, over 100 of a sample size, that's good. But 12, or even if it's under 20, like that's wild.
But then having said that, like case studies are quite common in medicine and medical journals. And case series studies are really common. So I think it was maybe seen as that, but that's not how it was publicized. You know, it was publicized the same way that you would publicize a study where you've got 500,000 people or something. You know, it wasn't this like very tentative thing. They did a big press release where Wakefield said that the vaccines, he wasn't anti all vaccines. He was anti this specific MMR because he wanted people to have separate vaccines, which it turned out he had financial interest in. So the separate measles vaccine, the separate mumps vaccine, the separate rubella vaccine.
Can we just make a footnote on this? Can you just 90 seconds? Can you just explain why I'm fixated on the sample size at the N? So what happens generally over in terms of statistical power when we have a higher N, et cetera? Can you just give the 90-second footnote?
Well, I mean, everything else held equal, larger studies will be more accurate. That is, larger samples will have a more accurate representation of the characteristics of the population from which they're taken. All else held equal. Now, obviously, you can still have biased samples, and you have samples that are way off in whatever direction. Maybe you've only selected people who happen to pick up the phone when you rang them to invite them into your study. So that's a different kind of thing. But generally, bigger studies are better, are more precise. So that's one thing. And also, when you get to very, very small numbers, the representativeness is going to be very, very hard. So it's not going to be a representative sample of whatever population you're looking at. 12 people is not enough to contain enough information about the general population. So these could be some very kind of outlying cases, and you wouldn't know that until you came along and did a much bigger study. So having a small study is bad. Right. Turned out in the years. I should say that when that paper came out in the Lancet in 1998, it caused an enormous firestorm in the UK and later rest of the world media, where people started associating autism with vaccines. And we had campaigns in several of the newspapers in the UK saying, don't give your kid this vaccine. Famously, Tony Blair, who was the Prime Minister at the time, was asked, did you give your son this vaccine? And he kind of didn't answer the question and stuff like that. And so like it was a very, very bad time. And this is where the origins of the kind of current anti-vaccine movement come from. Is this paper? Although there has been an anti-vaccine movement since vaccines were invented, like way back. Yeah. But the modern anti-vaccine movement, it turned out that it wasn't just that the paper was like had a small sample and was maybe off in some way. It's that it was actively fraudulent. So this came out in the subsequent years. The journalist Brian Deere, who has actually recently published a book called "The Doctor Who Fooled the World," which is about his investigation into the paper, which is worth reading. Came out last year, or the year before last. He found that in fact the paper was fraudulent. So Wakefield had falsified the medical records of the kids. So some of the kids, he claimed that had the vaccine, had in fact not had the vaccine. Some of the kids had their symptoms of autism, like the kind of regression of their behavioral characteristics and so on, before the vaccine was given. So there were like the claims that were made in the paper were totally off. They were actually fake. And there followed a huge long process of like getting Andrew Wakefield. We call it being struck off. I don't know what you say in the US, but like he was stopped from being able to practice medicine in the UK.
You're what's the word? You're not. It's
There's maybe an equivalent term.
There's an equivalent term. I can't think. I'm drawing a blank on it. But anyways,
he's no longer allowed to practice medicine. But it took a long time. The paper wasn't retracted. I can't remember exactly how many years, but like maybe a decade or so, or maybe more, after the paper was published, that it actually finally got retracted from literature. So it was just sitting there, a part of the scientific literature for that long, even though people knew it was wrong, fraudulent, misleading, caused all these bad effects. So it's a classic example of where low quality standards at a journal plus, active, publicity and on the part of the scientists, and I would say malicious, publicity, and that he was, he knew that he was publicizing something that was fake, and yet he did it anyway, potentially for financial reasons. And then this extremely slow process of the whole thing we talk about science being self-correcting, this extremely slow process of science correcting itself. It's a nice example of, it's one of the worst examples of how that can, lead to really bad consequences. And, the best things that would have happened there would have been for the paper never to have been published in the first place, because it was such a low quality thing, or for it to be labeled extremely clearly, like, this is a majorly tentative, small pilot case series. This is not, you should not draw any conclusions from this. I don't think you would get something like that in a top medical journal today. Certainly not written up in the way that it was. And obviously it was fraudulent in the first place. But even if it was real, because people have to some extent learned some of the lessons from the Andrew Wakefield story. But yeah, that, and he's still around, Andrew Wakefield, like he pops up at anti-vaccine events. I kind of expected him to become a sort of COVID anti-vaccine figure during the pandemic, but I didn't see much of him during the pandemic, so I don't know where he's kind of gone. There were other figures who took that role.
Yes.
During the pandemic, but he he didn't seem to be a big player in the pandemic, but he has popped up since getting struck off the medical record in the UK. He was like someone made a film about him that was being promoted and things like that. So he's kind of a very publicity hungry scientific fraudster who's I think got a lot of blood in his hands.
Oh yeah. I mean, yeah. Well, I think the other thing was like he did time, right? Did he do like legal time or he was just disbarred or disboarded or whatever?
I don't think. I can't recall exactly. My understanding was
he had to pay a penalty or something.
The paper was retracted, and the paper was retracted, and he was struck off the medical, which is like the ultimate thing as a doctor.
But he admitted that he lied, right? Like he admitted to this stuff, that he made this stuff up, or it was fraudulent, or no, he never admitted to it.
I don't know if he ever actually admitted it. I'm not certain. I mean, it became completely clear once Brian Deere had the real medical records from the kids.
Yeah,
that it was false. So I can't recall exactly what his sort of statements were after that was discovered.
Yeah, I think that's again another thing where I guess there's some. I'll talk about it in a minute, but when communities in science, social sciences, or medicine, or physical sciences, or whatever, when they start really championing a study, I always get red flags. I'm like, wait, like, let's see. Okay, not quite the same as this in this way, but there was that recent example of like, oh, SSRIs are bullshit. They don't really work and like treat depression. I mean, that was the more recent one, and everyone was like throwing that around online for a week and a half, and was like, "See, I'm gonna stop taking my sertraline because this is garbage." And it's like, oh boy, here we go again. Like, it's one paper, and a lot of people are talking about it, and that's fine. But we do all of these things within medicine, within, you know, all of the different disciplines, and you try to replicate it. You try to see, okay, how does this work? What is this like for every person, et cetera, or not every person, but for different types of groups, and like, how is this effective? So I guess the thing here is you also talk about, so this was like the case for fraud, the Wakefield thing, but you also talk about publication bias. And so maybe just generally, you can give examples if you want as you explain it, but it's something that has happened, and I've mentioned it once or twice here before, is this thing called p-hacking, which is definitely in the kind of statistical nuance here, which is fine. You can be as detailed as you want. So don't feel you have to just, surface over it, but just kind of explain what p-hacking is and how easy it is to do and how many people won't catch it, which is even other, I mean, I probably wouldn't catch it because I'm not doing research on a regular basis, and why that's problematic.
Yeah, well, scientists have this criterion for statistical significance, and you hear a lot in the media about statistical significance. These people often say weird things like, "This study was not statistically significant," and that kind of usually implies to me that they don't really get they don't really understand what that term means. But that is a term that people are aware of, and the problem is that people want their study to be statistically significant because it means that the result is, it means to them that the result is real to some extent.
Right.
And there's basically this threshold that we have to get to, the p-value, which is calculated from a statistical significance test, has to be lower than 0.05. And if it's lower than 0.05, then it passes the threshold and we say this result is statistically significant. If it's higher than 0.05, we say it's not statistically significant. And usually that would be a null result, and that means that the finding doesn't work. The drug doesn't work, whatever it is. The problem is that if you keep running statistical significance tests with slightly different variations of your data, maybe you drop a few participants out, maybe you add a few participants in is another thing, you run a slightly different version of the significance test, you correct for one variable that you didn't correct for before. If you keep running different statistical significance tests, you're way more likely to find, just by chance, a statistically significant result that actually is a false positive. So it's actually not really a statistically significant result. And people don't realize the extent to which this happens. I think people don't know quite how rapidly you can get yourself into finding false positive results if you just keep checking the significance of the result along the way. And this is why this pre-registration thing is important, is that you should really only do the analyses that you sort of plan that you do, or at least those should be kind of separate from the ones that you then did subsequently, so people can see, okay, these are the planned analyses. I know that they only tested 3 p-values here, so the chance of a false positive is fairly low, whereas if you tested 50, then there's probably going to be a couple of false positives in there. And yeah, as you say, the kind of insidious thing is that you can convince yourself that this p-hacking, as people call it, like trying to get that p-value below 0.05, you can convince yourself that it's exactly the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
That in fact you're doing, oh yeah, that person really wasn't paying attention in the psychology experiments, so I'll cut their data out. Or that person show, well, let's remove all the people who have a BMI over 25 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can convince you, oh, there's a good rationale for that.
Mm-hmm.
But what you're doing often in those cases is you're unconsciously moving towards finding the result that you want, and that's where the hacking, the p-hacking, comes in. And this is a widespread problem. It's quite hard to notice, as you say, because
mm-hmm.
the difference between a p-hack paper that has a result of less than p is less than 0.05 and a paper that was, really, that was really the only test that they did, and they didn't fiddle around with data. It's not super obvious.
Mm-hmm. This isn't just a scientist or a researcher, double checking their work, making sure they got their stats right. It's not that. It's where you literally will maybe you do that, and then you find the results, and you're like, shit, I just spent all this time doing all this stuff. Well, you know what? Maybe if I just add some people in, take some people out, change this, and let's say the first time it doesn't work, and you're like, well, okay, well now let's try and then you just keep doing that until you get whatever you want.
And the other form of it is when you have a big data set with loads of variables in it, and you just kind of dredge through it and just find a whole bunch of different things, and then you just say, oh well, the study really was about this statistically significant thing that we found. So you've actually tested a whole bunch of stuff, but you're you're retrospectively only focusing on the thing that turned out to be statistically significant, and you already know that it's statistically significant, and so you wouldn't necessarily have focused on it if you didn't already know what the result is. So
that's right.
So that's where the problem comes in. And there are some things that you can sort of notice, like if loads of the p-values in a paper are just under the threshold, it's kind of an indicator that they might have, it's unlikely in a normal circumstance that all the p-values would be just below 0.05. So that might indicate that people have been a bit dodgy with the statistics and just run things in such a way that just gets it just and no more under, and then stop. So yeah, those are some things, and I think that. We've talked about scientific fraud, and we've talked about with Andrew Wakefield, and we've talked about other kinds of biases where things go wrong. But I think the modal kind of bias that you see when you go to scientific talks, read scientific journals, see scientists talking about the research, is that kind of thing where you want to find a result, you want to, you're really interested in finding a positive result. And you don't realize that what you're doing when you do your analysis is pushing towards that positive result, even if that's actually not what the data unambiguously say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a little bit harder to kind of notice, and you need either a good team or you need to just have a really good kind of awareness and ethic. I wanted to ask about the growth mindset that you had referenced recently. And so maybe just that question, and then I'll have like a final tie it all together kind of question. So that's good?
Yeah, fine.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So one thing here is many of the social sciences, we talked about it earlier, these fads, right? You have grit, and you have, I think people are very, very excited about epigenetics, I think too quickly. People talk about GWAS studies, which again, I think they're great, but people kind of push it where it's not there yet. And one of these things is the growth mindset. Again, a recent piece that you wrote, it was on this in particular. And so you talk about it, and I know that there's been a couple papers that have been out there where they'll have identical conclusions, but then they'll be used for totally different narratives, which is fascinating. So, and I'm sure this happens, right? And I understand there's small effect sizes in both, but what do you make of this, and how things like this will happen, probably more often than we realize?
Yeah, it happens, the case of the growth mindset, it was like a paper by growth mindset proponents that found a fairly small effect in an objective sense. Those proponents were like, well, compared to other educational interventions, this is actually, a fairly big effect. And they were actually incredibly critical of this meta-analysis that came out and found actually a very similar sized effect in the meta-analysis. but the general tone of the writing of that meta-analysis was kind of anti-growth mindset, was saying, well, it's a smaller effect. And I side with the people who say that it's a smaller effect because the original growth mindset proponents massively hyped things up for decades before the actual good quality research came in. So you had this decline effect, as it's been called, where, if you read the original papers and the original books, especially the books that were out in public, they've been read by millions of people. Mm-hmm. TED Talks have been seen by millions of people. Mm-hmm. The claims there that growth mindset is, which is, by the way, is this idea that if you have a growth mindset, that you believe people can change, and you believe people can change their abilities and grow in their capacities. Whereas if you have a fixed mindset, you think that people are kind of stuck in their level of intelligence and they can't really change. And there's kind of a spectrum of one to the other. It was written up as if this idea, once you get this idea in your head, that it'll change your life. Right. That suddenly you'll start to understand people. Suddenly you'll do better at school. Suddenly you'll blah, blah, blah. It's amazing to me that, and I'm not, I said in the article, like, it's not like I want a big apology from the growth mindset proponents or anything, although it would be nice, but like, I'm not advocating for that. Samin Bazir described it as the kind of hype first, data later thing, which is like, they have this idea, massively hype it up, and then a few decades later we get stuff. And by the way, it gets into every school. Every school talks about growth mindset.
100%,
yes. Growth mindset strategy.
Yes.
And then a few decades later, the good studies come in, the quality studies done. Some of them done by the original proponents of growth mindset, which say, well, actually, kind of growth mindset is, has an effect, but it's a small effect, but that's in the context of education, that's actually quite good, and all that sort of stuff. So, like, you can see why people would be frustrated by that sort of thing. It'd be nice if you did the studies first, and then, if you find exciting results, then you can take them to the public. So this was done completely backwards. Yep. In this case, another instance of the same thing happening is the famous book about antidepressants, the drugs being bad, by Irving Kirsch. That they have an effect size of, I think it's like Cohen's D of 0.2 or something was the effect size. And the big conclusion of that was, well, antidepressants are bad and useless. There's a meta-analysis that came out of all the studies of antidepressants that said they have a Cohen's D of about 0.2, and the conclusion of that meta-analysis was antidepressants are pretty good, in terms of their effect size compared to other things we know about depression. So there's a lot of context involved in interpreting these scientific questions and having these rules of thumb about like what an effect size means. I think my conclusion from the kind of discussion around my growth mindset article and all that sort of stuff, I think having those rules of thumb is often really quite misleading.
Yeah, I like the framing of it. It's hype first and data later. It feels that way with a lot of stuff. And then what happens is that even if you have the same people that did the original studies, if they come back and say, well, actually, I know this kind of got a lot of, traction, but, this isn't quite what we said it was, and we're trying to claim all these things, people don't listen to it anymore. It's like, no. We're already here. We're already doing this. I mean, the clearest example, and to her credit, I know that she's kind of admitted to some of this, is grit. I mean, people were all about this, and it was like, we had a couple studies, and it was like, okay, that's interesting. And then really it's just some variant of conscientiousness or whatever the one of the big five is. Like, it's not
correlated very strongly with conscientiousness. Yeah,
almost where it's like, is it a totally new construct? I mean, probably not. Maybe a subdivision of it. So anyways, this stuff happens all the time, and you can't reel it back in. And that's what is so difficult. So last question here is, so we've been alluding to it kind of throughout the conversation, but so, what are some ways, you kind of mentioned in the back of your book, that we could fix some of this stuff? Like how could this be done well? Such as, pre-registration, or kind of doing, preprints or things like that. Like, what are some ways in which we could really improve science and how we do science? And obviously there's something that has to be, that institutions and journals need to do their part as well. So, but that notwithstanding, just in general, how do you think we can improve many of these things?
Well, yeah, I give lots of examples in the book, but I think one thing that I underplayed in retrospect is the idea of registered reports. Mm-hmm. I think registered reports are a genius idea, which really fix a lot of the problems of science. So we talked at the very start about how people, do an experiment, write it up, submit it to journals, and then it gets judged and, reviewed, and editor decides to publish it or not. Registered reports turn that whole process on its head in a good way. So registered reports are where, in some, a couple of hundred journals now offer this, even though it's still a very, very tiny minority of the papers that are actually published. In those cases, you submit the plan for your paper, your introduction and method section, basically, the analysis that you plan to do, the particular type of data you're going to collect and all that. You submit that before you go and actually collecting the data to the journal. Peer reviewers then review your plan, and they say, well, maybe you should change that analysis. Maybe you shouldn't do that. Maybe you should actually collect a much bigger sample because that's not going to be enough, whatever. And then if the peer reviewers agree, you can go back and forth with them and change, adjust things. If the peer reviewers then agree that your study would be a good test of the particular hypothesis that you've got, the journal says, and this is the really important thing, we'll publish it regardless of what the results are. Results come out positive, we'll publish it. Results come out negative, we'll publish it. Results come out ambiguous, we'll still publish it.
It's almost like a contract of sorts.
Exactly. And if you do what you say you'll do, and we've agreed, we'll publish it, the article. So, and then you go off and actually do the experiment. Then you submit it later to the journal, and they check that you did what you said you do. And if you have, you get a paper. And it kills this problem of publication bias, because the journal are not making the decision to publish or not based on the results of your study. They're making the decision to publish or not based on the design, the quality of the methods of your study. And I think that's so important. I'm actually we've just been working on a registered report. I wrote about it a little bit in the Works in Progress magazine, which people can look at if they want. And I really genuinely think I actually am at the point now where I think it should be an opt-out thing. Like, you should just by default be doing a registered report with your research. And if you can't do that, then you should explain why. We had a brilliant experience where the peer reviewers, instead of just coming along and criticizing, which is all peer reviewers can do normally, because the studies are already been done, maybe can suggest some new analyses, but they're not going to be able to change the design of the study because it's already been done. They can actually give you genuinely good ideas, which you can then go and do, which they did in our case. They gave us a couple of new analyses and said, we'd really like it if you did this. And it was like, yeah, sure, we'll add that in. It's not frustrating at that point. It's not like, oh, I have to go back and do, a bunch of stuff on this study that I've already finished and I already wrote it up. It's really annoying. It's like, oh no, they're taking an active role in helping design the study. Yeah. Anyway, there's loads of ideas in the book about changing the way we fund science, changing the way we think about scientific culture and all that. But I think the one thing that I underplayed, and I wish I'd written, there's a paragraph on it, but I wish I'd written more, is registered reports. And I think that's anyone who's doing science right now should investigate that and should ask themselves, why can't I do it this way? Because there's so many advantages of doing it that way compared to the old, flawed methods that we have.
Yeah, no, I don't do research at the moment, but all of my friends that do have also really enjoyed this as well. There might be some cons to it, or some tweaks to work out, but overall the idea is really, really, really good. Well, look, Stuart, you've been so generous with your time and your energy. It's been such a blast talking with you about all of this stuff, and you have just such a very wonderful way of communicating these things, which is what we need. Again, the book is called Science Fictions: How Fraud, Bias, Negligence, and Hype Undermine the Search for Truth. It's out in paperback. It's out in the UK. It's out in the US. You get it everywhere, I'm assuming. Yeah. Any work on any new books or just the Substack? Or
I'm working on a proposal for the next book, which kind of follows on from science fictions, I think, but I've been a bit distracted by having to do the Substack all the time, so I'm a bit slow on that. So, but it's coming. It's coming.
Okay, good. That's good to hear. I'm glad that you're working on something.
Thanks for having me on. It's been really nice to chat.
Yeah, of course. Real quick, where can people find you?
I'm on the Substack is stuartritchie.substack.com. I'm on Twitter, Stuart J. Ritchie. Those are the main places I think that you can find stuff. And there's various things I write in various magazines that pop up every so often. But if you follow me on Twitter, I tweet out everything that I write. So I'll see you there.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It's been great. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
All right. Thank you.